They say blood runs thicker than water, but what happens when that blood carries different dreams, different paths, different definitions of success? This isn't about sibling rivalry or family feuds. This is about the moment when everything you thought you knew about someone gets turned completely upside down, when assumptions crumble and truth stands so tall it can't be ignored anymore. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and for 12 years, my family believed I was the daughter who couldn't quite measure up, who took the easy way out, who gave up when things got tough. They were wrong about everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Cedar Falls, Iowa, success had a very specific definition in the Mitchell household. It meant following the path our father Robert had laid out, carrying on traditions that stretched back 3 generations, and above all, never backing down from a challenge. Our family had run Mitchell's hardware store since 1952, and every conversation at dinner seemed to circle back to duty, honor, and proving your worth through action. My brother David understood this language from birth. When he was 7, he organized the neighborhood kids into mock military drills in our backyard. When he was 12, he earned his Eagle Scout badge faster than anyone in Cedar Falls history. When he was 16, he was already talking to Army recruiters, mapping out his future with the precision of a battle plan. I was different. Where David was loud and confident, I was quiet and observant. Where he led from the front, I preferred to understand the whole picture before making a move. When David practiced his push-ups in the garage, I was in my room reading military history books, fascinated not by the battles themselves but by the strategic thinking behind them. When David talked about charging into combat, I dreamed about the intelligence officers who helped commanders make decisions that saved lives. But in the Mitchell family, quiet didn't equal strong, thoughtful didn't equal capable, and planning didn't equal courage. The pattern started early. When David won his first wrestling match, the whole family drove 2 hours to watch him compete at state championships. When I scored the highest in my class on the military entrance exam, my mother Linda smiled absently and said that was nice while she folded David's wrestling uniform. When David announced he was enlisting in the Army straight out of high school, our father shook his hand with tears in his eyes and said he'd never been prouder. When I mentioned I was considering the Marines, the conversation somehow shifted to whether I'd thought about community college instead, maybe something more practical, more suited to my personality. David left for basic training with a send-off party that filled the Cedar Falls Community Center. Half the town showed up. The local newspaper ran a feature story about the Mitchell family's military tradition continuing through their son. There were speeches about service and sacrifice, about carrying on the family name with honor. 3 months later, when I quietly enlisted in the Marine Corps, my parents drove me to the bus station in relative silence. My mother packed sandwiches and worried about whether I'd be warm enough. My father handed me $50 and said he hoped I knew what I was doing. The difference became even more pronounced during our respective training periods. David's letters home were read aloud at family dinners, shared with neighbors, posted on my mother's Facebook page. His stories of obstacle courses and weapons training were treated like dispatches from the front lines of American heroism. My letters, when they came, were shorter, more reserved. I couldn't tell them about the advanced intelligence courses I was taking, the security clearance applications I was filling out, the evaluations that kept placing me at the top of my class. Most of what I was learning couldn't be shared with family anyway. So instead, I wrote about the weather at Quantico, about the food in the mess hall, about missing home. David's first deployment was treated like a national holiday in the Mitchell household. Yellow ribbon magnets appeared on every family car. A framed photo of him in full battle gear took center stage on the mantelpiece. Care packages were organized with military precision, sent monthly with notes from everyone in town. When he came home for his first leave, the VFW threw him a hero's welcome. He looked exactly like what Central Iowa expected a soldier to look like, broad-shouldered and confident, with stories that fit perfectly into their understanding of what service meant. My own deployment was different. I couldn't tell them where I was going, couldn't explain what I'd be doing, couldn't share the details that would help them understand the weight of what I was carrying. When I called home from undisclosed locations, The conversations were stilted, filled with long pauses and careful words. I could hear the disappointment in my father's voice, the way he'd clear his throat when he didn't know what to say. I could sense my mother's confusion about why her daughter seemed so distant, so changed by something she couldn't quite grasp. The assumptions grew stronger with each passing year. When David got promoted to staff sergeant, the promotion ceremony was live-streamed for the whole family to watch. When I earned my own promotions, the ceremonies were classified, attended only by other intelligence officers and commanders, whose names I couldn't mention. When David's unit received commendations, the local newspaper ran follow-up stories about Cedar Falls' favorite son. When I received my own recognition, it came in the form of sealed envelopes and private meetings with officials whose titles were more impressive than anyone in my hometown could imagine. The distance between perception and reality grew wider with each deployment, each assignment, each level of responsibility I quietly accepted. My family saw a daughter who called less frequently, who seemed tired during visits home, who couldn't explain what she did for a living in terms they could understand. They saw someone who lacked David's obvious enthusiasm for military life, who didn't have his collection of visible achievements, who seemed to be drifting rather than climbing. They couldn't see the security clearances, the classified operations, the responsibilities that came with managing intelligence assets across multiple theaters of operation. The moment that crystallized everything happened on a humid Thursday evening in July. I was home on what my family assumed was just another routine leave, sitting at our old kitchen table while my mother prepared dinner, and my father read through the day's receipts from the hardware store. The conversation had been flowing in its usual pattern: updates about neighbors, questions about whether I was eating enough, careful avoidance of topics that might require me to explain the unexplainable. Then David called. His voice came through the speakerphone with that familiar blend of exhaustion and excitement that marked the end of a long training exercise. He was calling from Fort Campbell, where his unit had just completed what he described as the most challenging field operation of his career. As he talked about night maneuvers and tactical scenarios, I found myself automatically analyzing the strategic elements he mentioned, recognizing training patterns I'd helped design in briefings he'd never know I'd attended. But I stayed quiet, letting him have his moment, watching my parents' faces light up with the kind of pride that had become as predictable as sunrise. Then came the announcement that would change everything. David's voice shifted to something more serious, more formal. His unit was being assigned to a joint operation training exercise, something bigger than anything they'd participated in before. Multiple branches, high-level coordination, the kind of operation that could make or break military careers. Captain Rodriguez had personally selected David's. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Fuad to represent their battalion, and they'd be working alongside Marine intelligence units in what David described as a career-defining opportunity. My mother immediately started asking questions about safety protocols and communication schedules. My father wanted to know about the prestige of being chosen, whether this would help David's promotion prospects. I sat there feeling a familiar knot form in my stomach, the same sensation I'd experienced countless times when family conversations veered close to territories I couldn't discuss. This particular operation wasn't just something I knew about. It was something I'd spent the last 8 months planning. The training exercise David was describing so excitedly was part of a larger strategic initiative I'd been coordinating between 3 different command structures. The Marine intelligence units he mentioned weren't just participants in his career-defining moment. They reported directly to me. The tactical scenarios his squad would be facing had been developed based on intelligence assessments I'd written, threat analyses I'd compiled during deployments my family knew nothing about. Captain Rodriguez, the officer David spoke about with such reverence, had been in meetings where my recommendations shaped the entire structure of the operation. But I couldn't say any of that. Security clearances don't bend for family pride, and classified information doesn't become less classified because your brother happens to be involved. So I offered the appropriate congratulations, asked the kinds of questions a concerned sister might ask, and swallowed the strange irony of watching my parents celebrate David's participation in something I'd helped orchestrate from levels of command they couldn't imagine. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with David explaining the timeline, the location, the significance of being chosen for such a high-profile assignment. My parents absorbed every detail, already planning how they'd share this news with neighbors and friends. This would be another chapter in the ongoing story of David Mitchell, Cedar Falls' military success story, the son who is making the family name proud in ways everyone could understand and celebrate. After David hung up, the kitchen fell into the comfortable quiet that marked the end of these family calls. My mother started setting the table while humming something under her breath, the way she did when she was particularly content. My father folded his reading glasses and looked at me with the expression he wore when he was trying to bridge the gap between David's obviously successful military career and whatever it was I did that seemed so much less definitive. "Maybe this would be a good time for you to reconnect with your brother," he said, his voice carrying that careful tone parents use when they're trying to offer guidance without being too direct. "I know you two have grown apart since you both enlisted, but David's really making something of himself. It might be good for you to see what advancement looks like, maybe get some ideas about your own career path." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a fire I couldn't extinguish. Here was my father, genuinely trying to be helpful, suggesting that I might benefit from observing my younger brother's military success, unaware that the very operation he was celebrating had been shaped by decisions I'd made in briefing rooms David would never enter. I could see the concern in his eyes, the parental worry about a daughter who seemed to be treading water while her brother swam confidently toward shore. My mother chimed in from the stove, her voice bright with the kind of optimism that had always been her default response to family complications. "You know, Sarah, you've always been so good at supporting others. Maybe you could find a role that plays to those strengths." David mentioned that military operations need all kinds of support staff: communications specialists, administrative coordinators, the people who keep things running smoothly behind the scenes. Behind the scenes. Support staff. The words landed with a precision that would have been impressive if it weren't so completely backwards. Here was my mother, trying to encourage me toward exactly the kind of work I was already doing, except at levels of responsibility and strategic importance she couldn't fathom. The intelligence assessments that shaped military operations across 3 different theaters didn't write themselves. The coordination between military branches that made David's upcoming exercise possible didn't happen automatically. Someone had to be behind those scenes, making decisions that rippled through command structures in ways that never appeared in newspaper articles or family phone calls. But I couldn't explain any of that without violating oaths I'd taken and security protocols that existed for reasons my family would never need to understand. So instead, I nodded and said I'd think about it. The same response I'd been giving to career advice for years. The same careful deflection that had become as natural as breathing. That night, I lay in my childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling where David's high school wrestling trophies still caught streetlight from the window. The room hadn't changed much since I'd left for Quantico, still decorated with the achievements of the daughter my parents thought they understood. Academic awards from high school, a few photos from basic training, a small collection of books that revealed nothing about the clearance levels I'd achieved or the operations I'd overseen. 3 doors down the hall, David's room had been transformed into something approaching a shrine. Military commendations covered one wall, photos from deployments filled another, and a carefully maintained display case held medals and insignia that told the story of a military career my parents could follow and celebrate. Every piece of his advancement was visible, quantifiable, something they could point to when neighbors asked how the Mitchell children were doing. The irony was overwhelming. In less than 2 weeks, David would participate in a training exercise where he'd follow tactical protocols I'd helped develop, work with intelligence units that reported through my command structure, and hopefully benefit from strategic decisions I'd made during planning sessions that started before he'd even known the operation existed. He'd return home with stories about working alongside elite Marine units, about the complexity of joint operations, about the impressive coordination that made everything run smoothly. And my parents would celebrate another chapter in David's military success story, never knowing that their daughter's fingerprints were all over the strategic framework that made his achievement possible. The behind-the-scenes work my mother had encouraged me to consider wasn't some future possibility. It was exactly what I'd been doing for years, just at levels of responsibility and security clearance that couldn't be shared over family dinners or posted on social media. The real challenge wasn't the secrecy itself. Military families learn to live with classified information, with deployments that can't be discussed, with loved ones who disappear for months at a time into operations they can't describe. The challenge was watching my family create narratives about success and failure, about achievement and disappointment, based on incomplete information. They were measuring my military career against David's visible accomplishments, unaware that the very metrics they were using had been shaped by work I couldn't discuss. I thought about Colonel Thompson, my first mentor at Quantico, who'd warned me about exactly this kind of situation. Intelligence work, she'd explained, meant accepting that your most significant contributions would often be invisible, that the strategic decisions you helped shape would be credited to field commanders, that the operations you planned might never appear in any public record. The satisfaction had to come from the work itself, from knowing that lives were saved and missions succeeded because of analysis you'd provided and decisions you'd influenced. But she'd also warned me about the personal cost of that invisibility, the way it could create distance from civilian family members who measured military success in terms of visible rank progression and public recognition. The work we did was essential, she'd said, but it required a different kind of strength than the obvious courage displayed by combat troops. It required the ability to let others receive credit for your contributions, to watch family members worry about your career progress while knowing you were advancing through command structures they couldn't see. The patterns had been there since childhood, but it took years for me to understand how deeply they would shape everything that followed. Growing up in the Mitchell household meant learning that achievement came in very specific forms, that success had to be visible to count, and that quiet accomplishments were somehow less valuable than loud ones. David learned this lesson early and used it to his advantage. I learned it too, but drew completely different conclusions about how to navigate the world. When we were children, David's bedroom wall was covered with certificates from every sport, every competition, every activity that came with public recognition. Track and field ribbons from middle school, perfect attendance awards, citizenship medals from the local Rotary Club. Each piece of paper represented not just an achievement, but proof of achievement, something our parents could point to when relatives visited or neighbors asked how the kids were doing. David understood instinctively that accomplishment without documentation was worthless in our family's ecosystem. My own achievements followed a different pattern. I won the regional science fair in 8th grade with a project about cryptography and code breaking, but the trophy was modest and the ceremony was small. I scored higher on standardized tests than anyone in Cedar Falls history, but test scores lived in school files, not on bedroom walls. When I taught myself 3 programming languages during high school, creating security software that impressed my computer science teacher enough to forward it to his contacts at the state university, there was no ribbon ceremony, no newspaper article, no tangible proof of something most adults couldn't understand anyway. Our parents noticed these differences but interpreted them through their own understanding of what mattered. David's achievements were social, visible, easy to celebrate. Mine were solitary, technical, difficult to explain to neighbors over backyard barbecues. When David won student body president, our father took time off work to attend the inauguration ceremony. When I was quietly recruited by the National Security Agency for a summer internship program reserved for the top 1% of high school students nationwide, the letter arrived during David's graduation party, and the celebration was too loud for anyone to focus on mail. The military recruitment process revealed these patterns in even starker terms. David's path to enlistment was straightforward, celebrated, comprehensible to everyone involved. He met with Army recruiters in public, at the high school career fair, with our parents present for every conversation. His plans were discussed at family dinners, shared with extended relatives, posted about on social media. When he committed to infantry training, our father spent hours talking about the family's military history, about great-grandfathers who'd served in previous wars, about carrying on traditions that stretched back generations. My own recruitment happened differently. The Marine Corps officer who first approached me didn't do it at a career fair or in a public setting. She visited during my senior year, after someone had flagged my security internship performance, and my academic record in strategic studies. The conversation took place in my high school guidance counselor's office, behind closed doors, with discussions about opportunities that couldn't be detailed until after additional background checks and security clearances were processed. I couldn't share the specifics with my family because I didn't fully understand them myself yet. The terms the Marine recruiter used were unfamiliar, the career paths she described were unlike anything David had discussed, and the timeline for advancement seemed to operate according to different rules than traditional military progression. When I tried to explain my interest in intelligence work, my parents heard uncertainty where I felt clarity, heard complexity where I felt purpose. The disparity became even more pronounced during our respective training experiences. David's basic training was documented extensively, with regular phone calls home, letters that could be shared, and a steady stream of updates about his progress through various phases of infantry preparation. Our parents could follow his advancement using terminology they understood, could track his success through metrics that made sense to civilian observers. My training at Quantico was different from the beginning. The Marine Corps intelligence program operated with security protocols that made regular communication impossible. The coursework I was completing couldn't be discussed over phone calls home, the evaluations I was receiving weren't the kind that could be shared with family members, and the career track I was entering required security clearances that took months to process and verify. When I called home during training, the conversations were necessarily vague. I could mention physical fitness requirements, describe the Virginia weather, talk about the food or the dormitory arrangements. But I couldn't explain the strategic analysis courses that were challenging me more than anything I'd encountered in high school. Couldn't describe the simulation exercises where I was learning to coordinate intelligence assets across multiple theaters of operation. Couldn't share the feedback I was receiving from instructors who were preparing me for responsibilities I was only beginning to understand. My parents interpreted this vagueness as lack of engagement, as evidence that I wasn't thriving in military life the way David was. They heard uncertainty in my voice when I struggled to explain what I was learning, heard hesitation when I couldn't provide the kind of detailed updates that David's calls always included. The security requirements that were shaping my training experience looked like disinterest from their perspective, like someone who wasn't fully committed to military service. The first major divergence came during our initial deployments. David's deployment was to a forward operating base where his infantry unit was conducting security operations that could be described in general terms during family communications. He could talk about the landscape, the weather, the camaraderie among his fellow soldiers. His letters home included photos that didn't violate operational security, stories about interactions with local populations, descriptions of daily routines that helped our parents understand his experience. My first deployment was to a joint intelligence facility where I was analyzing threat patterns and coordinating information sharing between military branches and civilian agencies. The work was intellectually demanding in ways I hadn't anticipated, requiring me to synthesize information from sources I couldn't identify, to make recommendations that would influence operational decisions I couldn't discuss, to work with personnel whose names and positions were classified above my family's security level. The communication restrictions were total. I could send brief emails confirming that I was safe and healthy, but I couldn't describe my daily work, couldn't mention my colleagues by name, couldn't share any details about the significance of what I was contributing to larger strategic objectives. From my family's perspective, I had disappeared into some anonymous corner of military bureaucracy, while David was serving his country in ways they could understand and take pride in. The advancement patterns that followed reinforced these perceptions. David's promotions came with ceremonies that could be photographed, with new insignia that was visible to anyone who understood military ranking systems, with increased responsibilities that could be explained in terms our parents could grasp. Squad leader, then section leader, then staff sergeant, each advancement accompanied by documentation that could be shared with family and friends. My own advancement happened through channels that were largely invisible to civilian observers. Intelligence work meant that increased responsibility often came with decreased visibility, that higher security clearances meant fewer details that could be shared with family members, that strategic importance was often inversely related to public recognition. My promotions were noted in classified personnel files, celebrated in closed-door ceremonies attended only by colleagues with appropriate clearance levels. When I made lieutenant, the ceremony took place in a secure facility with no family members present and no photos that could be taken home. When David made staff sergeant, our parents drove 6 hours to attend a public ceremony where they could watch him receive new stripes and pose for pictures that would be framed and displayed in our family living room. The contrast between these experiences created a narrative about military success that my family could understand and measure, a narrative where David was clearly excelling while I seemed to be marking time in some undefined support role. The complexity of modern military operations made these misunderstandings almost inevitable. Intelligence work, by its very nature, operated according to different rules than traditional combat roles. Success was measured in prevented attacks rather than completed missions, in strategic advantages that might not become apparent for months or years, in coordination between agencies that civilians would never hear about. The work I was doing was essential to operations that David and soldiers like him would eventually participate in, but the connection between strategic intelligence and tactical execution wasn't visible to outside observers. During family gatherings, these differences crystallized into uncomfortable conversations about career prospects and personal success. David could share stories about training exercises, about leadership challenges, about the satisfaction of serving alongside other infantry soldiers. His military experience translated easily into civilian terms, with accomplishments that our extended family could understand and celebrate. When relatives asked about my own military service, I found myself offering vague responses about administrative work and coordination responsibilities. I couldn't explain that my administrative work involved coordinating intelligence assets across multiple continents, that my coordination responsibilities included briefing senior military officials about strategic threats they needed to understand. The security classifications that made my work significant also made it invisible to family members who were trying to understand what I was contributing to military operations. The breaking point came during David's homecoming celebration at the Cedar Falls VFW. The entire town had turned out for what was being billed as a hero's welcome, complete with yellow ribbons, American flags, and a banner stretched across Main Street that read, "Welcome home Staff Sergeant David Mitchell." I had been home on leave for exactly 3 days, trying to decompress from an assignment I couldn't discuss, when my mother informed me that attendance at this event wasn't optional. The VFW hall was packed beyond capacity, filled with neighbors who had watched David grow up, high school classmates who remembered him as the star wrestler, and veterans from previous wars who saw in him a continuation of something they valued deeply. The mayor was there to present a key to the city. The local newspaper had sent a photographer. David's former wrestling coach had prepared remarks about dedication and perseverance. This was Cedar Falls, honoring one of its own, celebrating the kind of military service the community could understand and take pride in. I stood near the back of the room, wearing my dress uniform because my mother had insisted, trying to blend into the crowd while feeling increasingly like an imposter at my own brother's celebration. The speeches began with predictable themes about sacrifice and service, about young men who answered their country's call, about the pride the community felt in David's accomplishments. Each speaker seemed to know exactly what David had contributed to national security, exactly why his service mattered, exactly how his deployments had made America safer. David took the podium with the confidence that had always characterized his public speaking, his uniform pressed to perfection, his bearing every inch the professional soldier our parents had always envisioned. He spoke about the honor of serving alongside dedicated soldiers, about the importance of completing missions that protected American interests abroad, about the satisfaction of representing Cedar Falls and Iowa on foreign soil. His words carried the weight of visible accomplishment, of service that could be quantified and celebrated. As he spoke, I found myself mentally cataloging the classified operations that had made his deployments possible, the intelligence assessments that had shaped his unit's tactical decisions, the threat analyses that had kept soldiers like him alive during missions they would never know had been influenced by information I had helped gather and interpret. His stories about successful operations were celebrations of outcomes I had helped engineer from command centers he would never see. The disconnect was overwhelming. Here was my brother, receiving recognition for participating in military operations that had been shaped by strategic decisions I had influenced, standing before a crowd that included our parents, who continued to worry about whether I was making adequate progress in my own military career. The very success they were celebrating had been built on foundations I had helped lay, using intelligence frameworks I had helped design, implementing security protocols I had helped develop. But the most painful moment came during the question and answer session that followed David's formal remarks. Someone from the audience asked about military intelligence, about how soldiers in the field received the information they needed to make tactical decisions. David's response was thoughtful and respectful, acknowledging the importance of intelligence support, while making it clear that he interacted with that system primarily as a consumer of finished products, rather than someone who understood its internal workings. "The intelligence folks do incredible work behind the scenes," he said, his voice carrying genuine appreciation. "We get briefings before every operation, threat assessments that help us understand what we're walking into, strategic guidance that keeps us focused on our objectives. I don't pretend to understand how all that information gets gathered and analyzed, but I know it makes the difference between successful missions and dangerous situations. Behind the scenes." Those words again, spoken this time by my own brother, in front of our parents and our entire community. I watched our father nod approvingly, watched our mother smile with pride, watched the audience absorb David's gracious acknowledgement of intelligence support as evidence of his maturity and leadership potential. No one in that room understood that the intelligence briefings David valued so highly were produced by officers like me, that the threat assessments he relied on were compiled by analysts working at security classification levels that made their contributions invisible to public recognition. The evening continued with more speeches, more presentations, more opportunities for community members to express their pride in David's service. I participated when appropriate, applauded when expected, smiled when photographed alongside my brother during family pictures that would later be framed and displayed in our parents' living room. But inside, I was experiencing a kind of cognitive dissonance that felt almost surreal. During the reception that followed, conversations swirled around me like background noise from a movie I wasn't really watching. Neighbors offered congratulations that felt hollow because they were based on incomplete information. Extended family members asked questions about my own military service that I couldn't answer honestly without violating security protocols that protected operations these civilians would never need to understand. Well-meaning veterans from previous wars shared advice about military career advancement that revealed how little they understood about modern intelligence work. The most difficult conversation came with my high school guidance counselor, Mrs. Peterson, who had been instrumental in helping me navigate the college application process and had maintained an interest in my post-graduation success. She pulled me aside during a quiet moment, her expression carrying the kind of concerned warmth that had made her effective with uncertain teenagers. "Sarah, I have to ask," she began, her voice low enough to avoid being overheard by nearby conversations. "Are you happy with how your military service is going? I know it's different from David's experience, and I just want to make sure you're finding fulfillment in whatever role you've chosen." The question was asked with genuine care, but it revealed assumptions that had become increasingly common in conversations about my military career. Mrs. Peterson, like my parents and most of our community, had observed the visible differences between David's advancement and my own apparent lack of progress, and had drawn conclusions that seemed logical based on available evidence. She was worried about me in the way adults worry about young people who seem to be struggling to find their direction. I gave her the same careful response I had perfected over years of similar conversations, expressing appreciation for her concern while deflecting specific questions about my duties and responsibilities. I assured her that I was learning valuable skills, that I felt my service was meaningful, that I was grateful for the opportunities the Marines had provided. All of this was absolutely true, but it was also incomplete in ways that made the conversation feel fundamentally dishonest. Mrs. Peterson's follow-up questions revealed the depth of community assumptions about my military experience. She asked whether I had considered pursuing additional training that might lead to more visible advancement, whether I had thought about transferring to a different military specialty that might offer better career prospects, whether I needed help connecting with resources that could support professional development. Each question was based on the premise that my current situation represented some kind of career stagnation that needed to be addressed. The irony was almost unbearable. Here was someone who had known me since I was 17, who had helped me apply for the security internship that had ultimately led to my Marine Corps recruitment, expressing concern about military career prospects that were actually advancing faster than anything she could imagine. Mrs. Peterson was worried that I wasn't achieving my potential, unaware that I was working at classification levels that represented the highest applications of analytical potential within the military intelligence community. As the evening wound down, family members gathered for final photographs and farewells. David was surrounded by well-wishers who wanted to shake his hand one more time, to express their pride in his service, to wish him success in whatever assignments lay ahead. The photographer from the Cedar Falls Gazette positioned family members for a formal portrait that would accompany the feature story about the homecoming celebration. I found myself standing slightly apart from the central group, not because I was intentionally distancing myself, but because that had become my natural position in family gatherings over the years. The photographer noticed and gestured for me to move closer, to complete the family grouping for the official picture. I stepped forward and smiled appropriately, but I felt like someone playing a role in a story I couldn't fully participate in. The final photograph showed the Mitchell family united in celebration of David's homecoming, all of us wearing dress uniforms, all of us looking appropriately proud and supportive. What the photograph couldn't capture was the complexity of emotions beneath those posed expressions, the weight of information that couldn't be shared, the frustration of watching family members draw conclusions based on incomplete data about military service they couldn't fully understand. That night, I lay in my childhood bedroom thinking about the conversations I had heard throughout the evening, the assumptions that had been voiced and reinforced, the narrative about military success that had been strengthened by community celebration. David had become the visible symbol of effective military service, the kind of soldier Cedar Falls could understand and take pride in. I had become something more ambiguous, someone whose contributions were less definable, whose advancement was less obvious, whose future prospects seemed less certain to outside observers. The celebration had been genuine and well-deserved. David was an excellent soldier who had served with distinction in challenging circumstances. The community's pride in his accomplishments was appropriate and meaningful. But the evening had also reinforced perceptions about military service that made my own contributions invisible, that suggested visible advancement was the only meaningful measure of military success, that confirmed assumptions about which Mitchell's sibling was truly excelling in uniform. After David's homecoming celebration, something shifted inside me that I couldn't quite name at first. It wasn't anger or resentment, nothing as simple as that. It was more like a quiet settling, the way dust settles after a windstorm, leaving everything visible but somehow rearranged. I had spent years carrying the weight of my family's misconceptions, trying to bridge the gap between who they thought I was and who I had become. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom surrounded by outdated decorations and faded achievements, I realized I was tired of carrying that weight. The next morning brought unexpected clarity. I woke before dawn, a habit ingrained by years of military discipline, and found myself sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and the local newspaper's coverage of David's homecoming. The article was exactly what I had expected: glowing descriptions of his service, quotes from community leaders about pride and patriotism, a large photograph of him addressing the crowd at the VFW. There was a smaller photo of our family group, where I appeared as a supportive sister, unnamed in the caption, present but peripheral to the main story. Reading that article, I made a decision that surprised me with its simplicity. I was done trying to manage my family's perceptions of my military career. I was done offering careful deflections when they asked about my progress, done accepting their worried suggestions about career changes, done pretending that their assumptions about military success were the only valid measurements of achievement. I had spent 12 years building a career that mattered, advancing through levels of responsibility that required skills and clearances most people would never understand. It was time to let the truth speak for itself. The opportunity came sooner than I had anticipated. 3 days after David's celebration, my mother mentioned that his unit was preparing for another training exercise, something involving multiple branches and coordinated operations. She shared this information with the same proud uncertainty that characterized most of her discussions about military matters, clearly not understanding the details, but recognizing that this assignment represented another advancement in David's career trajectory. I listened to her description with growing recognition. The joint training exercise she was describing wasn't just something I was familiar with. It was the culmination of 18 months of strategic planning that I had overseen from the beginning. The operation David's unit would be participating in had been designed by a planning committee I had chaired, using intelligence frameworks I had developed, implementing security protocols I had personally reviewed and approved. But this time, instead of maintaining my usual careful silence, I found myself asking specific questions. What were the training objectives? Which bases would be involved? How long was the exercise scheduled to run? My mother answered what she could, clearly pleased by my sudden interest in David's military activities, unaware that my questions were coming from a very different perspective than she imagined. As she talked, I realized that this training exercise would provide the perfect opportunity for truth to emerge naturally, without any intervention from me. Captain Rodriguez, David's commanding officer, would be working directly with Marine intelligence units that reported through my command structure. The operational briefings David would receive would be based on strategic assessments I had written. The coordination protocols his unit would follow had been developed by teams I supervised. More importantly, Captain Rodriguez was someone I had worked with extensively during previous joint operations. He knew my rank, my responsibilities, my reputation within the intelligence community. If David's family was going to be involved in any way with this training exercise, if there were going to be family events or ceremonies connected to the operation, Captain Rodriguez would recognize me immediately as someone far different from the struggling sister my family imagined me to be. The next few weeks passed in a state of suspended anticipation. I returned to my assignment at Camp Pendleton, throwing myself into final preparations for the training exercise, with an intensity that surprised my colleagues. This wasn't just another operation for me. It was potentially the moment when years of carefully maintained separation between my professional achievements and my family's perceptions would finally collapse. The exercise itself was scheduled to run for 2 weeks, involving over 3,000 personnel from 4 different military branches. David's unit would be participating in advanced tactical scenarios designed to test coordination between ground forces and intelligence support systems. From my position in the command structure, I would be overseeing the intelligence components that would guide their training objectives, monitoring their progress through systems they would never see, ensuring that the scenarios they faced provided realistic preparation for actual operational deployments. During the first week of the exercise, I received regular reports about David's unit's performance. They were exceeding expectations, demonstrating exactly the kind of tactical proficiency and adaptability that had made them good candidates for this training opportunity. Captain Rodriguez's evaluations were consistently positive, noting strong leadership potential and effective team coordination. From a professional standpoint, I was proud of my brother's performance, even though he had no idea I was in a position to monitor his progress. The convergence I had been anticipating came during the exercise's second week, when Captain Rodriguez requested a face-to-face briefing about intelligence assessment protocols his unit would be implementing during the final phase of training. This was routine procedure for operations of this complexity, but it meant that he would be coming to my facility, attending meetings where my role and rank would be completely visible. The briefing took place in a secure conference room at Camp Pendleton, with Captain Rodriguez and 2 other field commanders receiving detailed intelligence updates about the scenarios their units would be facing over the next 3 days. I led the briefing personally, walking them through threat assessments, communication protocols, and coordination procedures that would govern their operational activities. Captain Rodriguez's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. When I entered the conference room and was introduced as the briefing officer, his expression shifted from professional attention to something approaching shock. He clearly recognized me, not just as someone he had worked with before, but as someone whose rank and responsibilities were significantly higher than he had expected to encounter in this context. During the briefing itself, his questions revealed his growing understanding of my position within the command structure. He asked about strategic coordination at levels that confirmed he was beginning to grasp the scope of my responsibilities, requested clarification about intelligence protocols that revealed his awareness of my security clearance levels, made comments about operational complexity that demonstrated his recognition of my role in designing the exercise framework. After the formal briefing concluded, Captain Rodriguez approached me with the kind of careful formality that indicated he was still processing what he had learned about my position. His first question was direct and professional. Had I been involved in the planning stages of this training exercise? When I confirmed that I had been the primary coordinating officer for intelligence components, his expression shifted to something that looked almost like disbelief. His next question was more personal, asked in the lowered voice that military personnel use when discussing matters that might be sensitive. Did I have family members participating in this exercise? When I explained that my brother was part of his unit, Captain Rodriguez's reaction was immediate and visible. He stared at me for several seconds before shaking his head slowly, as if trying to reconcile information that didn't fit together properly. "Staff Sergeant Mitchell is your brother?" he asked, his voice carrying a tone I couldn't quite identify. When I confirmed this, he continued staring at me with an expression that suggested he was working through implications I couldn't anticipate. Finally, he spoke again, his words careful and measured. "Ma'am, I think there might be some family conversations that need to happen," he said. "Your brother has mentioned you several times during this exercise, and the picture he's painted doesn't quite match what I'm seeing here." This was the moment I had been anticipating without fully understanding what it would feel like when it arrived. Captain Rodriguez was offering to be the bridge between my professional achievements and my family's perceptions, but accepting his offer would mean abandoning the careful separation I had maintained for years. It would mean exposing my family to information about my career that might fundamentally change their understanding of military service, of success, of the choices I had made. I told Captain Rodriguez that I appreciated his concern, but that family dynamics were complicated by security requirements that made full disclosure difficult. He nodded with the understanding of someone who had navigated similar challenges in his own military career, but his expression suggested that he was struggling with something beyond simple family miscommunication. The next day brought unexpected developments. Captain Rodriguez contacted me through official channels, requesting a meeting that he described as both professional and personal. When we met, he explained that he had been thinking about our conversation, about the disconnect between my family's perceptions and my actual position within the military hierarchy. He had a proposal that he thought might address the situation without violating any security protocols. The upcoming weekend would mark the conclusion of the training exercise, with a ceremony recognizing units that had demonstrated exceptional performance during the 2-week operation. Captain Rodriguez's unit was scheduled to receive commendations for their tactical excellence, and family members had been invited to attend the ceremony. David had already arranged for our parents to drive down from Iowa to witness this recognition. Captain Rodriguez suggested that this ceremony might provide an appropriate context for my family to understand my role in military operations, without requiring detailed discussions about classified information. As the commanding officer responsible for intelligence coordination, I would be presenting some of the unit commendations, introducing field commanders who had excelled during the exercise, explaining the strategic importance of the training scenarios that had been completed. The proposal was elegant in its simplicity. My family would attend a military ceremony expecting to celebrate David's achievements, and they would discover that their daughter was not only present in a professional capacity, but was actually one of the senior officers conducting the ceremony. They would see my rank displayed on my uniform, hear my introduction as a strategic planning officer, witness me presenting awards to field commanders like Captain Rodriguez. I agreed to Captain Rodriguez's suggestion, but with the understanding that I wouldn't be orchestrating any dramatic revelations or family confrontations. If my parents and David chose to approach me after the ceremony, we could have whatever conversations seemed appropriate. If they preferred to process this information privately, that would be equally acceptable. The truth would be visible for anyone who wanted to see it, but I wouldn't be forcing acknowledgement or demanding recognition. The weekend of the ceremony arrived with typical Southern California weather, bright sunshine and clear skies that seemed designed for military pageantry. I arrived at the parade ground early, reviewing final preparations with other members of the command staff, ensuring that the ceremony would proceed smoothly and that all participating units would receive appropriate recognition for their performance during the exercise. As family members began arriving, I spotted my parents and David near the designated seating area for unit families. They looked exactly as I had expected. My mother wearing her best dress and carrying a small camera, my father in the suit he reserved for formal occasions, David in his dress uniform looking every inch the professional soldier they were proud to celebrate. They were scanning the parade ground with the interested attention of civilian observers, trying to understand the significance of what they were witnessing. The ceremony began with traditional military formality, with color guards and national anthem performance, with speeches from senior commanders about the importance of joint training operations and the excellence demonstrated by participating units. As the program progressed through various recognition categories, I could see my family's attention focusing on the portions that would involve David's unit. When the time came for Intelligence Coordination Awards, I stepped to the podium as scheduled, wearing my dress uniform with all insignia clearly visible, carrying myself with the bearing that 12 years of military leadership had developed. I began my remarks with standard acknowledgments of unit performance and strategic coordination, explaining the complexity of joint operations and the importance of intelligence support in modern military effectiveness. As I spoke, I could see my family's gradual recognition of who was addressing the ceremony. My mother's expression shifted from polite attention to something approaching confusion, then to a kind of stunned realization. My father leaned forward in his seat, studying my uniform insignia with the focused attention of someone trying to decode information that didn't match his expectations. David's reaction was the most complex, his face cycling through recognition, surprise, and what looked like a growing understanding of implications he was still processing. When I called Captain Rodriguez to the platform to receive his unit's commendation, his interaction with me was formally professional but carried undertones that anyone paying attention would recognize as indicating significant respect for my position and authority. As I presented the award and shook his hand, he made eye contact with David in the audience, his expression carrying a message that was unmistakable even from a distance. The rest of the ceremony proceeded according to schedule, with additional awards and recognition for other participating units, with closing remarks from the base commander about the success of the training exercise and the strategic value of continued joint operations. Throughout these final portions, I could sense my family's attention divided between the ongoing ceremony and their processing of what they had witnessed. After the formal conclusion, there was a reception period when family members could interact with military personnel, ask questions about the training exercise, and celebrate with the service members they had come to honor. I remained in my official capacity, speaking with various unit commanders and family members, but aware that my own family was approaching slowly, still appearing uncertain about how to process what they had observed. The conversation, when it finally happened, was more subdued than I had anticipated. My parents approached with the careful formality that civilians often adopt when speaking with military officers they don't know well, despite the fact that I was their daughter. My mother's first words were a hesitant question about whether I had been involved in organizing the ceremony. My father asked about my role in the training exercise that David's unit had just completed. David's questions were more direct and professional, reflecting his understanding of military hierarchy and protocol. He asked about my rank, about my responsibilities during the exercise, about the scope of intelligence coordination that had been required for an operation of this complexity. His tone carried a growing recognition of implications that extended far beyond this single ceremony. Captain Rodriguez's intervention was perfectly timed and professionally appropriate. He approached our family group and requested permission to speak with my parents about my role in the training exercise their son had just completed. With their consent, he explained that I had been the primary intelligence coordination officer for the entire operation, that the strategic planning and security protocols that had made the exercise successful had been overseen by their daughter, that David's unit had benefited directly from intelligence frameworks I had developed. The conversation that followed was unlike any family discussion we had ever had about military service. Captain Rodriguez spoke with the authority of someone who understood both the significance of intelligence work and the challenges of explaining classified responsibilities to civilian family members. He described my professional reputation within the joint operations community, my advancement through leadership positions that required exceptional analytical skills and strategic thinking, my role in coordinating operations that supported ground units like David's across multiple theaters. My parents listened with expressions that cycled through surprise, confusion, pride, and what might have been a growing understanding of how much they had misunderstood about my military career. David's reaction was more complex, reflecting his professional knowledge of military hierarchy and his personal processing of family dynamics that suddenly looked very different than they had appeared for years. The revelation didn't resolve everything immediately, didn't magically repair years of misunderstanding, or instantly change family dynamics that had been established over more than a decade. But it did provide a foundation for different kinds of conversations, for recognition of achievements that had been invisible for security reasons, for understanding that military success could take forms that weren't immediately visible to civilian observers. That evening, our family had dinner together for the first time in years, where my military career was discussed as something successful and significant, rather than something to be worried about or quietly redirected. My parents asked questions about my training, about my responsibilities, about the career progression that had led to my current position. David shared his perspective on the intelligence support his unit had received during deployments, expressing new understanding of the connection between strategic planning and tactical success. The conversation wasn't a complete transformation of family relationships, but it was a beginning. My parents began to understand that their daughter had achieved exactly the kind of military success they had always hoped for, just in forms they hadn't recognized or understood. David gained insight into intelligence work that helped him appreciate the complexity of military operations he had participated in, without fully comprehending their strategic foundations. Most importantly, I finally felt able to be fully present in family conversations about military service, to share appropriate details about my work and achievements, to accept recognition for accomplishments that had been invisible for too long. The careful separation between my professional success and my family relationships wasn't completely eliminated, but it no longer felt like a burden I carried alone. 6 months later, I received a promotion to full colonel, with ceremony and recognition that my family was finally able to attend and understand. David was there in dress uniform, our parents were there with appropriate pride, and Captain Rodriguez was there as a friend and colleague who had helped bridge the gap between perception and reality. The promotion represented not just professional advancement, but the integration of family relationships with professional achievements that had been separated for too long. The story didn't end with dramatic reconciliation or family apologies, because real life rarely provides such neat resolutions. Instead, it ended with understanding, with recognition, with the quiet satisfaction that comes from being seen clearly by the people who matter most. My family's assumptions about military success expanded to include forms of achievement they hadn't previously recognized. My own sense of identity became more integrated, no longer requiring careful separation between professional accomplishments and personal relationships. Looking back, I realized that the challenge hadn't been my family's failure to understand my career, but rather the inherent difficulty of recognizing achievements that operate outside traditional frameworks for measuring success. Intelligence work, by its nature, requires accepting invisibility as a component of effectiveness. My family's struggle to recognize my contributions reflected broader civilian challenges in understanding military roles that don't fit conventional narratives about service and achievement. The resolution came not through confrontation or dramatic revelation, but through patient willingness to let truth emerge naturally when circumstances allowed. Captain Rodriguez's intervention was significant not because he forced recognition, but because he provided context that helped my family understand information they had been missing. The ceremony was powerful not because it created artificial drama, but because it offered a setting where my professional achievements could be visible without violating security requirements. Years later, when people ask about my military career, I tell them about the importance of patient persistence, about the value of work that matters even when it isn't immediately recognized, about the satisfaction that comes from contributing to something larger than individual achievement. I tell them about family relationships that can be repaired when understanding replaces assumption, about professional success that doesn't always require public recognition to be meaningful. Most importantly, I tell them about the lesson I learned during those years of invisible service, that true achievement doesn't depend on external validation, but on the knowledge that your work makes a difference even when no one is watching. Recognition, when it comes, is gratifying, but it isn't necessary for work to be meaningful or for service to be valuable. The Marine Corps taught me many things about leadership, about strategic thinking, about the importance of mission accomplishment. But my family taught me something equally valuable about patience, about the long-term perspective required to maintain relationships across years of misunderstanding, about the possibility of recognition emerging naturally when conditions allow for truth to be visible. Today, my parents display my military commendations alongside David's, understanding finally that both of their children have served with distinction in roles that complement each other within the larger framework of national security. David and I maintain close relationships that include professional respect for each other's contributions to military effectiveness. Captain Rodriguez remains a friend and colleague who understands the complexity of family dynamics within military careers. The story became not about validation or recognition, but about the integration of personal identity with professional achievement, about family relationships that can evolve when understanding replaces assumption, about the quiet satisfaction that comes from work that matters whether or not it receives public acknowledgement. It became a story about patience, about the long-term perspective required to maintain important relationships across years of misunderstanding, about the possibility that truth eventually finds ways to emerge when conditions allow for clear sight. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.